My name is Madeline Rhodes. I am 35 years old, and in my family, I am still the weird oldest sister who works with computers somewhere. Last Friday night, my younger sister dropped a message in the group chat that might as well have been a door slammed in my face. Don't come to the barbecue this weekend. My wife says you will make the whole party stink. No explanation, just that. A second later, the screen filled with laughing reactions and hearts from our parents. My phone buzzed like it was all one big joke, and I was supposed to laugh along. I stared at the message long enough for the typing bubble to appear and disappear twice. Then I wrote one word and hit send. Understood. I set the phone down, turned it face over on my desk, and went back to reviewing contracts that could buy my parents' neighborhood more than once. While they were busy reacting to a text about how I ruined a cookout, I was signing off on numbers that decide whose projects live and die. They still picture me in some cheap apartment, barely scraping by, grateful for any invitation. So when they finally decided I was not welcome, I did not beg, and I did not argue. I decided I would let them see exactly who they had just pushed out. If you have ever been the punchline in your own family, or the wallet everyone jokes about until they want something, stay with me, tap subscribe and turn on notifications, because you will want to hear what happened the next morning when two familiar faces walked into my office and realized whose name was on the door. Morning settled over the building with the same quiet rhythm it always had, steady enough that I didn't expect anything unusual waiting beyond my office door. I had slipped into the kind of focus where numbers start forming their own landscape, where decisions are made in the space between instinct and experience. That calm broke the moment Nina's voice came through the intercom, clipped and uneasy, telling me that two women were downstairs asking for whoever handled private investments. No names, just insistence, and a tone that made it clear they weren't planning to leave without getting what they wanted. I already felt the pressure of their presence before they arrived, the kind of energy that precedes people who treat boundaries like inconveniences. When the elevator chimed, I didn't look up. I wanted to hear them first, to understand whether this was desperation, entitlement, or something darker. Footsteps carried across the floor, light, quick ones followed by heavier strides trying to match their pace. That pairing alone told me more about their dynamic than any introduction could. Their entrance shifted the air immediately. One moved like she owned the space, scanning everything with a level of confidence that wasn't earned from skill, but from believing the world should bend when she walked into it. The other stayed half a step behind, quiet enough that I could sense her nerves even without seeing her face. I didn't need to raise my head to know who they were. The silence that trailed behind them made the confirmation unnecessary. I finally looked up, not because I needed to, but because their shock demanded acknowledgement. Their eyes went straight to the nameplate on my desk, the one engraved in a way that leaves no room for misinterpretation. Seeing them register, it was like watching a door slam shut behind them, unexpected for them, inevitable for me. The loud one froze first, the shift from bravado to confusion happening so fast it almost felt rehearsed. The quieter one seemed to shrink, not out of guilt, but out of realizing she had miscalculated something important. They carried a glossy portfolio, oversized and heavy, the kind designed to impress people who evaluate ideas based on brightness of paper instead of quality of thought. I didn't reach for it. I didn't need to know what pitch lay inside to understand their intention. People who arrive without appointments on a weekday morning, demanding access to private capital, never arrive with integrity. They arrive with expectations, old habits, and a long trail of choices they would rather not discuss. The bolder woman placed the portfolio on my desk with a practiced flourish, like she had done it in front of dozens of decision-makers before. Yet her hands trembled just enough to betray her. Confidence built on shallow ground isn't confidence at all. It is balance on ice. She pushed the portfolio toward me as if proximity alone would obligate me to entertain their request. I let it sit untouched, absorbing the weight of what it symbolized. Their assumptions about me, about my life, about my role in theirs. My lack of reaction rattled them more than any refusal could have. Silence became a mirror they didn't want to look into. The room thickened with the tension of their unraveling composure, each second exposing another layer of anxiety they had tried to bury under forced enthusiasm. They shifted, exchanged glances, tried to read my expression, but I gave them nothing. That restraint was deliberate. Some truths reveal themselves only when the other side grows impatient. It didn't take long. The louder woman's posture stiffened, her breath sharpening the way it does when someone senses they are no longer in control of a conversation that hasn't even started. She seemed ready to speak, ready to push, ready to reclaim whatever leverage she believed she had walked in with. But she couldn't. Not when the room, the title, the atmosphere all contradicted her expectations. Nina appeared in the doorway at the exact moment their confidence cracked, her presence subtle but firm, signaling that their time in the building was no longer theirs to dictate. I rose slowly, reclaiming the room without a word, and watched the realization settle into their faces. They had entered with certainty. They stood now with doubt. And without a single sentence exchanged, the balance between us had already shifted beyond their reach. The building emptied out slowly after lunch, leaving the halls with the kind of quiet that makes every thought louder than it should be. I stayed in my office, letting the silence settle while the remnants of their visit replayed in my mind. The portfolio still sat untouched at the corner of my desk, its glossy cover catching the overhead light like an invitation I had no intention of accepting. I could feel the weight of it without lifting a finger. It wasn't a plan. It was a warning. Every instinct in me recognized that. I leaned back in my chair, letting my eyes trace the skyline through the glass. Raleigh had a way of reminding me how small problems really were, until they weren't. The city looked calm from 30 floors above, but I could sense turbulence building beneath the surface of the day, the kind that doesn't stay hidden for long, the kind that belongs to people who arrive asking for money they have no right to request. A vibration from my phone cut through the quiet. Notifications stacked on the lock screen. Missed calls, messages, alerts. None of them surprised me. People who walk into places they don't belong seldom leave quietly. Their certainty always transforms into outrage when consequences appear. I didn't open the messages. I didn't need to read the words to know the tone. People rarely change the script when they feel their grip slipping. Instead, I powered the phone off and slid it across the desk. I needed clarity, not noise. The moment the screen went black, my thoughts sharpened. Their appearance that morning hadn't been impulsive. It had been calculated. Their urgency, their insistence, their refusal to introduce themselves, all of it pointed to one truth. They were in deeper trouble than they wanted me to believe. They weren't seeking opportunity. They were seeking rescue. And if they were willing to show up at my office, then they were already planning something worse. I turned my attention to my computer, pulling up documentation I hadn't reviewed in months. Old financials, property files, tax records, the kind of information people forget exists until someone uses it against them. My stomach tightened as I scrolled, recognizing patterns I'd overlooked because I hadn't imagined anyone in my own family would try to exploit them. That assumption felt foolish now. A folder labeled Carrington House caught my eye. I hadn't opened it since the year I bought the property. Back then, it had been an act of quiet protection, a way to give someone in my family a chance to breathe without worrying about rent. That decision had aged poorly. I clicked it open, letting the reality of what I'd allowed sink in. Every payment, every update, every repair, my name stood alone. Their dependence wasn't accidental. It was structural. A convenience they had shaped into entitlement. The more I examined, the more I saw the pieces aligning in a way I could no longer ignore. Sudden expenses, quiet withdrawals, inconsistent tracking. None of it catastrophic on its own, but together it formed the outline of a pattern I recognized too well. Someone else benefiting from access to things they didn't own. Someone assuming the person responsible wouldn't notice. Someone planning to lean harder until something broke. A slow pressure built in my chest, not panic, but realization. I had allowed generosity to disguise itself as obligation for far too long. Their visit had only pulled the final thread. The truth had been unraveling long before they walked into my office. Now, it lay exposed. I closed the folder and rested my hand on the cool surface of the desk. My office had always been my refuge, the one place untouched by family expectations. That boundary had been breached the moment they stepped inside. And once someone crosses a line like that, they rarely stop. They test the next one. And the next. Until everything that once felt secure becomes open terrain for their decisions. The room felt heavier than it had that morning. Not darker, just clearer. I understood now that their presence wasn't a plea. It was a signal, a shift, a sign that whatever they had set in motion was already moving, whether I chose to acknowledge it or not. I straightened the papers on my desk, letting the small act ground me. There are moments when a person realizes the ground under their life is no longer firm. This was one of them. And once the truth becomes visible, pretending not to see it is no longer an option. The evening settled with a stillness that made every sound deliberate, and I found myself unable to ignore the sense that something was waiting for me beyond the usual end-of-day fatigue. I locked up my office later than usual, letting the quiet hallways absorb the weight of the thoughts that had followed me since morning. By the time I reached home, the sun had already slipped behind the trees, leaving the house in a muted glow that carried its own kind of tension. I stepped inside expecting nothing more than space to think, but the universe had other plans. A thick envelope rested in the center of my doorstep like someone had chosen that exact square of concrete for a reason. No return address, no markings, just my name typed in a way that felt too intentional to ignore. I carried it inside without hesitation, though the heaviness of it pressed on my fingers in a way that hinted I was holding a truth someone hoped I would mishandle. I didn't. I placed it on the kitchen counter, took a breath that didn't feel as steady as I wanted, and slid a knife beneath the seal. Documents spilled out in a stack bound by a single clip. Financial records, screenshots, court filings, notes. None of it belonged to me, yet all of it concerned people who had forced themselves into my day only hours earlier. I skimmed the first page, and a slow disbelief replaced whatever patience I had left. Someone had been watching them longer than I expected. Someone who understood their patterns far better than they realized. And someone who trusted me with evidence instead of explanations. As I moved through the pages, each one constructed a portrait of choices defined by carelessness, arrogance, and a practiced pattern of leaving others to carry the fallout. Credit lines opened and abandoned, loans justified with fabricated income, luxuries purchased on accounts that never should have existed. The same behavior repeating itself across different states, different years, different people. The names changed, but the damage stayed the same. My chest tightened with a familiar ache, not shock, but recognition. These weren't mistakes. They were methods, techniques, the kind of behavior shaped by knowing someone else would always absorb the impact. I paused at a page detailing a previous partner who had lost nearly everything because he believed promises not meant to be kept. The pattern mirrored itself with unsettling precision. My stomach turned, not because I hadn't imagined trouble, but because I had underestimated the scale of it. The envelope had one last item tucked in the back, a handwritten note on the corner of a grocery receipt. The message was brief, but the urgency behind it felt undeniable. Someone wanted me to see the truth before the people involved pushed their situation into something irreversible. I read the note twice, letting the uneven handwriting settle into my memory. Whoever sent it wasn't asking for anything. They were warning me. I laid the documents across the counter in a deliberate line, studying each one with a focus I hadn't felt in years. Every page carried its own weight, but together they formed a map leading straight to the moment those two women walked into my office with forced confidence and a glossy portfolio. They weren't just seeking investment, they were searching for a lifeline. And they were willing to cross any boundary to secure it. The realization shifted something inside me. The events of the day weren't isolated. They were consequences of choices made long before my involvement. I wasn't dealing with improvised desperation. I was dealing with a pattern of calculated risk taken on the assumption that someone else, someone like me, would absorb the consequences quietly. I gathered the documents into a single stack, aligning the edges with a steadiness that didn't match the pulse rising in my throat. Whatever came next, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Ignoring the truth was no longer an option. People who build their lives on borrowed trust rarely stop before everything around them collapses. And the collapse had already begun. Morning arrived with a crisp clarity that made everything feel sharper than usual, as if the air itself had decided to strip away whatever illusions still lingered from the night before. I walked into the office earlier than I needed to, not out of obligation, but because the weight of the documents had shifted my priorities. The building felt unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that leaves room for thoughts to settle into place whether you want them to or not. I opened my laptop, placed the stack of papers beside it, and let the day unfold with a deliberate calm I didn't entirely feel. The first step was simple. I sorted through my accounts, identifying every point of access that connected me to anyone else. Each line item reminded me of decisions made with the assumption that generosity would be appreciated rather than exploited. That assumption no longer belonged to me. I reviewed auto payments, paused transfers, and closed channels that had been left open out of habit rather than need. As I moved through the list, an unexpected steadiness replaced the frustration that had carried me through the previous night. Control wasn't loud, it was measured. The next task required more attention. I pulled up my credit reports from every bureau, scanning line by line with a level of scrutiny I hadn't used in years. At first, everything looked familiar. Then small inconsistencies began revealing themselves, minor inquiries, unfamiliar checks, activity that didn't match any decision I had made. Nothing catastrophic on its own, but combined with the documents delivered to my house, the message was unmistakable. Lines had been crossed in ways I hadn't yet understood. I filed fraud alerts where necessary, placing freezes that ensured no new accounts could be opened without my direct confirmation. Each confirmation email felt like another barrier being rebuilt, a boundary reinforced after being ignored for too long. The act wasn't vindictive, it was corrective. It was a reminder that protecting myself wasn't cruel. It was overdue. As the morning progressed, I reached for the folder labeled Carrington House, the same one I had studied the night before. The numbers hadn't changed overnight, but my understanding of them had. The property had been intended as stability, a step toward giving someone else the chance I once wished for myself. Now it existed as a silent ledger of imbalances, maintenance I had paid for, repairs done without acknowledgement, months where the weight of responsibility rested solely on my shoulders, while others lived comfortably within the space my effort provided. The realization sat heavily but cleanly. Kindness without boundaries isn't kindness, it's permission. I opened the mortgage portal and evaluated what needed to be done. The process wasn't complicated, but the choice behind it carried a gravity that felt strangely grounding. It wasn't retaliation. It was alignment, bringing reality back to a place where accountability followed action instead of avoiding it. Hours passed without interruption, the quiet efficiency of the office mirroring the resolve that had settled into me. I organized legal documents, drafted notices that clarified what would no longer be tolerated, and categorized every record for clarity. The work was meticulous, but it gave structure to a situation that had been spiraling in the background long before I acknowledged it. Somewhere in the middle of the afternoon, I paused and let myself absorb the shift that had taken place. The previous day had begun with an unexpected intrusion, a violation of space and respect. The night had brought truth I hadn't asked for but needed. Today was different. Today was the moment I stopped reacting and started recalibrating. There was no anger left in me, only certainty. Certainty that people who rely on deception rarely anticipate what happens when the person they depend on finally steps out of their script. Certainty that once boundaries are rebuilt, they stay in place. Certainty that the path forward would require decisions that could not be softened to make others comfortable. I closed my laptop, letting the quiet settle again. Nothing about the day felt dramatic. It felt necessary. And necessity has a way of reshaping everything it touches. By the time the next morning arrived, the sky had the washed-out look of a day that wasn't sure what it wanted to become. I felt the same way walking into the office, carrying a sense of anticipation that didn't feel rooted in anxiety, but in a quiet acceptance that the situation had moved beyond simple boundaries. I had spent the previous day fortifying every corner of my financial life, yet something in me knew the ripple of consequence would arrive soon. People rarely lose access without reacting. My phone confirmed that truth before I reached my desk. Notifications stacked across the screen with a kind of frantic persistence that revealed more than the content ever could. Calls at strange hours, messages delivered in long streams, emails marked urgent. The volume alone spoke of panic. I didn't need to open a single one to understand why. Losing access to the support they had relied on meant the structure they had built around my silence had begun to collapse. Desperation always announces itself loudly. I powered the device off without hesitation. Peace sometimes comes from the simplest actions. The office felt cooler than usual, as if the air conditioning had kicked in stronger to match the tension outside my life. I sat down and opened the folder of legal notices I had finalized the day before, reviewing each detail with deliberate care. The words were precise, the boundaries unmistakable. Every sentence existed to make sure there would be no misinterpretation left for anyone who believed ambiguity could be weaponized. I wanted clarity, clean, exact clarity that didn't depend on emotion or loyalty. It didn't take long before confirmation emails began to arrive, documents filed, notices logged, records updated. Every digital acknowledgement tightened the structure around decisions that had been delayed for too long. The more confirmations appeared, the more I felt the foundation beneath me settle into something solid. By late morning, security notified me of movement in the lobby. 2 individuals requesting access to my floor, insistent enough that their presence triggered protocol. The description alone told me who they were. I didn't go down. I didn't respond. I simply continued working, letting trained staff handle what was no longer my responsibility. Boundaries mean nothing if you abandon them at the first sign of discomfort. Reports came in minutes later. Raised voices, agitation, emotional outbursts, attempts to bypass procedure. I wasn't surprised. People accustomed to slipping through cracks react poorly when they finally meet a locked door. I returned to my documents, focusing on the final steps: property notifications, account closures, and the conclusion of every ongoing obligation I had once carried for them. As I worked through the checklist, an unexpected relief settled over me. Not satisfaction, just clarity. The truth had become factual, not emotional. A delivery arrived shortly after noon, signed by legal staff and brought to my desk with the same formality reserved for corporate matters. Inside the envelope was the official verification that the property notice had been served. The acknowledgement included the timestamp, the recipient's signature, and the image required for compliance. I stared at the documentation longer than necessary, letting the reality of it sink in. There are moments when a line becomes permanent, and this was one of them. As the afternoon stretched on, the building's atmosphere shifted. Conversations softened near my office, as if people sensed the tension without understanding the source. I kept to my work, ignoring the outside noise. The disturbance wasn't part of my world anymore, not professionally, not personally. Near closing time, I stepped away from my desk and stood near the window, watching the city move below. For the first time, I recognized a calm that felt earned. My decisions had been made without cruelty, strengthened by evidence and necessity. I had offered stability for years, and it had been reshaped into expectation without my consent. Correcting that imbalance wasn't retaliation, it was restoration. I returned to my desk, gathered my things, and shut down my computer. Nothing about the day had been easy, but it had been exact. And exactness was what the situation required. There are days that shift the trajectory of a life quietly, without chaos or spectacle. This had been one of them. The consequences had only just begun, but the direction was already fixed. A few weeks slipped by with an ease I hadn't felt in years, the kind that arrives only after decisions settle into place without hesitation. My days developed a quiet rhythm, mornings filled with work that carried its own momentum, evenings spent in the stillness of a home no longer tied to anyone else's weight. I didn't track the fallout closely. I didn't need to. Consequences have a way of surfacing whether you watch for them or not. Information reached me indirectly through administrative notices, property filings, and the automated updates attached to every action I had initiated. The timeline unfolded in a clean, almost clinical way. The 30-day window on the property expired without compliance, triggering the next step without intervention from me. Legal confirmation arrived stating that the occupants had vacated under pressure rather than cooperation, leaving behind a list of unresolved financial responsibilities that shifted back onto them the moment my support ended. Their names appeared in sections none of us ever expect to read our own in: collections, deficiency statements, employer verifications, termination notifications. Every document reflected a reality shaped by their choices, not mine. The weight of those updates didn't bring satisfaction. They brought clarity. Life in the United States rarely cushions anyone from the outcomes of financial misconduct, and the systems designed to track it rarely forget. Patterns built on borrowed credibility collapse quickly once the source of that credibility steps away. Their collapse wasn't dramatic, it was procedural. My parents' address appeared next in the sequence of automated records: mail forwarded, property listings posted, title transfers initiated. The house they once felt rooted in no longer belonged to them, and the urgency in the paperwork revealed more than any conversation could have. When the dust settled, they ended up in a rental they could maintain without leaning on anyone else. It wasn't a punishment. It was reality recalibrating itself. As for the two women who had stepped into my office with such unearned certainty, their trajectory dimmed gradually rather than explosively. Employment checks flagged unresolved liabilities, and their credit profiles narrowed the list of places willing to vouch for them. The decisions they had once made without considering impact now looped back in bureaucratic echoes: letters, notices, declined applications. The country does not forget who defaults on obligations tied to forged intentions. Their world contracted to the size their honesty allowed. Through all of it, I remained absent. No messages opened, no calls returned, no explanations offered. Distance became a structure rather than an emotion, and for the first time I understood how peace can feel like both armor and oxygen. I had created a life built on work, discipline, and quiet resilience, and none of those things required me to carry anyone else's recklessness. On a calm afternoon, I found myself reviewing the final email from my attorney, confirmation that every obligation, every account, every legal thread connecting me to them had been severed. The completeness of it settled over me with a sense of closure that didn't need celebration. I archived the email and closed the screen, letting the quiet room absorb the finality. Later that evening, I stepped outside onto my balcony, letting the air settle against my skin. The sky over Raleigh stretched wide and open, untouched by the chaos that had once tried to follow me into every corner of my life. I didn't look back toward what any of them were doing, or how they were adjusting to the new limitations carved by their own behavior. I didn't need to. My part in their story had ended the moment I stopped allowing their decisions to dictate mine. Standing there, I realized something I had never given myself the space to admit. Protecting your peace is not abandonment, it's acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that family is not defined by blood, but by boundaries. Acknowledgement that loyalty without reciprocity is self-destruction. And acknowledgement that silence is sometimes the strongest answer you can give. People ask whether cutting ties feels cold. The truth is simpler. Clarity is not cruelty, and sometimes the only way to preserve what matters is to walk away from what doesn't, no matter how loud it screams as it breaks behind you.